Well, welcome everyone. Welcome alumni and family members of alumni. It's great to have you here. My name is Paul Zernicke from the Office of External Relations. I'm joined by one of my colleagues, Chris. You'll see another colleague of mine who I think is, well, other back there, Haley. Anyone that you see with a staff sign, please know we are more than happy to assist in any way we can to make your reunion experience a memorable one. So good to have you here for this session. I must confess with regard to our next speaker that the last time I had the occasion to introduce him, I felt really inadequate afterwards. In fact, I remember going home and saying to my wife, you know, I introduced him, Andrew, and I don't know, I was flustered. And she said, what do you mean you were flustered? So, well, there's just so many great things to say about him. He's so legendary. And she sat and she paused and she thought about it for a minute. She said, well, you know, he's a rock star. And I said, well, that's true. Not that any of us have ever seen you dance or sing, but we know you're a rock star. And so she thought a few more moments and looked at me and said, you know, I think really what you should have done is just, you know, here's Andrew Lowe, and then you should really sit down, dear, and just shut up. You know, spouses can be pretty brutal. But she said it with a great deal of affection. I think more for Andrew than for me, probably. But at any rate, I'm going to follow that advice and just move very quickly to introduce to you the Charles E. and Susan T. Harris Professor of Finance, head of the Financial Engineering Laboratory. You all know him very well, talking about a very, very significant topic and an innovative approach to that topic. So, Andrew Lowe.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. Appreciate the introduction. I want to start by thanking all of you for coming today to this event. It's wonderful to see all of you. A number of my former students are here. Appreciate your making time to come be with us this weekend. And it's always a pleasure and a privilege for me to be participating in these alumni reunions because the amount of energy that exists in these activities is just tremendous. And having gone to alumni events at other universities, I can tell you that there really is something unusually energetic about the MIT alumni events. So I'm really delighted to be here and I'm very excited about the topic that I'm going to talk to you about today. So the title is Can Financial Engineering Cure Cancer? Please note that this is a question, not a declarative. So that means that there's some uncertainty, there's some more work to be done. But by the end of the next hour or so, I'm going to try to convince you that the answer is likely to be yes. And it's going to take me a while to make that case. I also want to mention that this work is jointly authored with some of my collaborators, David Fanyon, Jose Maria Fernandez, and Roger Stein. Let me explain to you how I got interested in this. Over the course of the last few years, a number of friends and family have been afflicted with cancer. And so naturally, I started learning more and more, not just about the disease, but as an economist, I had to focus on the business aspects of the cancer industry. And I ran into a rather puzzling conundrum that I'm actually hoping some of you might be able to help me with. My co-authors and I, we have a conjecture about how that conundrum can be resolved. But let me tell you what that conundrum is first, and then you'll see where I need your help. Over the last 10 years, we have made tremendous progress in the biopharma industry, and particularly in terms of our understanding of the molecular basis of disease. So, for example, in 2001, Novartis introduced this really new generation of drugs with Gleevec. Gleevec is a leukemia drug that was really designed from the molecular biology of the disease, and the first of its kind. And shortly thereafter, 2004, Avastin, another drug that basically blocks the growth of blood vessels in tumors, was introduced as well. In 2008, the first cancer genome, leukemia, was sequenced by the Genome Institute at WashU. And one of the most impressive things just occurred last year. Last year, a fellow by the name of Lucas Wortman developed a recurrence of a particularly nasty form of leukemia known as acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Now, Wortman got this disease when he was a graduate student, and at that time, they gave him traditional chemotherapy, and for a while, it looked like it was working, until he got a recurrence of it while he was in medical school, and then they gave him a bone marrow transplant from his brother. And looked like that worked as well. And so he got a job at the Genome Institute at WashU. And while there, he developed a second recurrence of this nasty kind of leukemia. Now, the survival rate for first-time recurrence of acute lymphoblastic leukemia is 5%. We don't have statistics for second recurrences of this disease. It's too small a sample. And so at that point, when he had that second recurrence, he started putting his affairs in order and saying goodbye to his friends and family. Except that his friends and family happened to be part of the circle at WashU's Genome Institute. And so they decided not to take things lying down. They went all out, no holds barred, 24/7, and they did everything in their power to save their friend. They sequenced the healthy DNA from his body. They sequenced his cancer's DNA. They sequenced his cancer's RNA, which is not something that you typically do when you're looking for these kinds of therapies. And when they sequenced his RNA, they discovered a particular gene that was overexpressed. And they found a drug using high-throughput screening methods. They found a drug, an approved drug, that is able to block that gene. The drug is Sutent, which is a kidney drug. It's not approved for leukemia, but they gave it to him anyway. And within days, he felt better. Within weeks, he was back at work. And months later, they actually can't find any more leukemia cells in his body. Now, they're not going to say that he's cured. That's why I put it in quotes. But the fact is, for all intents and purposes, he is. It's a miracle. It's phenomenal. It's good to have friends at the Genome Institute, isn't it? But here's the thing. That same year, last year, 2012, a fellow by the name of David Aponte was cured of the same disease, leukemia, acute lymphoblastic leukemia, but he was cured using a completely different method. Using his own body's immune system, they were able to deal with that disease to the point where he's also back at work and they can't find any more leukemia cells. So what's the conundrum? Well, here's the conundrum. The conundrum is that if you look at the investment rates of return of the biotech and pharmaceutical industry over that same period, it's shockingly mediocre. The average rate of return for both is minus 1%. In fact, the very best year of biotech was something like 2000, where there was a pretty high internal rate of return. But since then, year by year, the IRR for biotech startups has really declined. Now, these are averages, and no doubt there are exceptions. There are certain VC firms that have done exceptionally well. But as a group, the biotech and pharma industry have really offered some very, very poor rates of return to their investors, and not surprisingly, money is coming out of the space. In fact, PricewaterhouseCoopers put out a report that mentions that the number of startups in 2012 is the lowest it's been since 1995. How does that make sense? How is it the case that we've made such remarkable breakthroughs in our scientific understanding of the molecular basis of these diseases, and yet at the same time, we're pulling money out of the space just when we seem to be on the verge of several important breakthroughs? And the answer is, I don't know. But my co-authors and I, we have a conjecture. And this is where I need your help. Our conjecture is that we think the biopharma business model is broken. And in particular, it's broken in the sense that there are three aspects of the drug development industry that really are almost unique to that industry. There are a couple of other industries that have that same characteristics. And those three characteristics are, it takes an incredibly long time to tell whether or not you've got a drug. And second, it takes an incredibly large amount of money to figure that out. And third, the probability of success is really low. When those three conditions occur, it turns out, not surprisingly, that money comes out of the space, not into it. And at first, it was a real strange observation that I came to that ultimately I thought could make sense. The observation that I came to is that as we get smarter in the biopharma industry, the risks actually increase. Now, that's a really bizarre observation, isn't it? Because usually you think of getting smarter meaning you reduce the risk. Certainly in my field, financial investments, the more you know about what's going to happen in the future, the more you understand about the underlying mechanisms of your investments, the less risky it is, right? Pretty intuitive. That's not the way it works in drug development. For example, it used to be the case that develop a drug, you take a chemical compound, you try it out on all the folks that have a disease, and maybe it helps 10% of them, and maybe it kills 1% of them, and that's a good drug. It gets approved. And once that drug gets approved, everybody that has that disease has to take the drug, because you don't know whether you might be part of that 10% or, unfortunately, God forbid, you're part of that 1%. You've got to take a chance, particularly if it's a life-threatening disease like cancer. And so everybody buys the drug. Everybody buys the drug. But now we get smarter. We can sequence people's DNA. We can develop molecular biomarkers. We can figure out whether or not you've got a gene such that if you do, you will definitely respond to this drug. And if you don't, you definitely won't. So we can identify that 10%. And so what does that do? That's wonderful. It means that now you only have to give the drug to 10% of the population. And that 1% that would have been killed with the side effects, they're not at risk anymore. What you've just done is to wipe out 90% of the revenue base for this drug company. Thank you very much. And that, coupled with the complexities of what we now know about the mechanisms of cancer and other diseases, means that the various pathways that we have to search through is much, much more complex and therefore much more costly and much less likely to succeed because there are just so many more possibilities. And you take that and couple that with the fact that there's additional uncertainty due to economic conditions, and it's not surprising that investors are pulling money out of this space and putting it into lower hanging fruit, things like social media and technology. Now, it turns out that the traditional financing vehicles for these kinds of investments, venture capital, private equity, public equity, they're not ideally suited to these kinds of risks. It's far too risky for these types of investors to take on. That's where financial engineering comes in. Funding is declining despite and maybe because of better science. Well, maybe we can do something about that by using financial engineering to reduce those risks and improve some of these rates of return. And in particular, I'm talking about portfolio theory and securitization. Those are techniques that you may have come across. Those of you who took my classes when you were here, you certainly got exposed to those. But the fact is that applying these to the biopharma industry could have a transformative effect on dealing with the challenges that are facing that industry today. And that's what I want to talk to you about. That's what I'm hoping to show you. Now, before I do that, I have to acknowledge something, which is that portfolio theory and securitization are very much the same set of techniques that were involved in the financial crisis. And so you might be a little bit suspicious about how we're going to use this, the same thing that caused so much problems for the economy. So I want to spend a few minutes talking not about the biopharma industry, but rather about the financial crisis. And I realize that most of you have heard more than you ever want to hear about the crisis, so I'm not going to go through that all over again. But I'm going to give you a couple of aspects of the financial crisis that are particularly relevant for this topic. First of all, when I go over the financial crisis, I now reduce my entire remarks to one slide, and this slide is just a chart. It's one simple chart. And once you look at the chart, you will understand pretty much everything you need to know about the financial crisis. And the chart is a real home price index for the United States from 1890 to 2012. It's a real index, meaning that we've already taken into account inflation, so you can compare across time, apples to apples, right? These are constant dollars, purchasing power. And let me show you first what population looked like over that period of time. Obviously, population has grown quite a bit over the last 100 years. And so you would expect that there are more houses, but nevertheless, on average, you would think that housing would be approximately stable other than for economic conditions. So let me show you what the real home price index is from 1890 to the peak of the housing market in 2006. Here it is. Anybody notice anything unusual about this graph? I mean, we see the Great Depression and the effect that that had on home prices. That's not surprising. But what about this? What about the last 10 years between 1996 and 2006? Something happened there. During that period of time, we nearly doubled the value of the typical home in the United States. Double relative to its 50-year long-run steady-state average price. How? How did that happen? Now, of course, we know that things haven't had such a happy ending since that point. Actually, markets are ticking up. The home price index actually has gone up by about 11% over the course of the last year. So things are recovering quite significantly. But what happened here? That's what I want to talk to you about. And in particular, I want to focus on a specific financial engineering technique that was directly related to this, and that is securitization. So let me talk about securitization through a very, very simple example. I'm going to be purposefully simplistic. I apologize in advance to those of you who are in the industry. I don't mean to insult anybody's intelligence, but this is complicated enough that I want to keep it absolutely simple so that it's obvious to everyone what was going on. And those of you who are in the industry, correct me if you think I'm getting the intuition wrong. Let me start with a very simple question for you, which is, how much would you pay for a particular financial security? A piece of paper that is a $1,000 IOU, right? It's a bond. And it pays the holder $1,000 at a particular point in time, let's say next week. Now, this is a risky bond in the sense that there's a chance that you might not get paid. So you might get paid $1,000 with a certain probability, but you might get a default with another probability. And let's say it's 90-10. 90% of the time, you'll get paid $1,000. 10% of the time, you'll get paid nothing. Okay? What would you pay for this bond? Anybody? We can auction it off. So let's see. How many people would pay $1,000 for the bond? Okay, well, that's easy. All right, how many people would pay $950? How many people would pay $900 for the bond? Okay, a few folks. How many people will pay $890 for the bond? How about $880? $850? Okay, good. So this goes to show that there's no such thing as a bad bond. I take offense when people call these things toxic assets. There's no such thing as a bad bond, just bad prices. At some price, this bond is attractive, right? And it looks like it's around 900, maybe a little bit less. Not surprisingly, 900, because that's the expected value of the bond. So those of you who raised your hands, you were looking at the expected value. But in fact, if I offered this at 900, very few people would be interested in it. Even at 850, not a lot of you would be interested, because frankly, 10% is a pretty high default rate. So what if I gave you 2 of these bonds? Would that be better? You can get 2 of them instead of 1. Now, that sounds counterintuitive, right? Because it's like the 2 old ladies in the Catskills, and they're at a resort that's not particularly good, and they're at dinner, and one of the ladies says to the other, gee, the food here is really horrible. And the first lady, yes, I know, and such small portions. You know, why would you want more? If you didn't want 1, why would you want 2? Well, I'm about to tell you why. So let's suppose that we give you 2 of these identical bonds, and we put them into a portfolio. Now, what does that mean other than drawing a red circle around them? Well, it means that what we're going to do is to take these 2 bonds and put them into a legal entity, and then issue new securities that are claims not on the bonds but on the legal entity. And for sake of argument, let's just call this legal entity, I don't know, how about a special purpose vehicle? Okay? So we're going to create a special purpose vehicle that holds these 2 green bonds that are not particularly attractive. And then we're going to issue 2 new pieces of paper, and the new pieces of paper will be a blue bond and an orange bond, each of which has a face value of $1,000. So value is neither destroyed nor created. It's conserved, right? However, the 2 different colors indicate different priority. And what I mean by that is that the blue bond is going to be prior in terms of its seniority, meaning that the blue bond has to get paid first before the orange bond can get paid, okay? I'm going to just make that up. I'm going to just say blue means it's senior. And so I'm going to call this the senior tranche. And I'm going to call the orange bond the junior tranche to indicate that order of priority. Now, in order for us to figure out what the blue and orange bonds are worth, I need to tell you a little bit about how default works with these two green bonds. So let me assume that these two bonds default in a statistically independent way, as if they were just separate and independent coin tosses, okay? That's an assumption, and we'll come back to that assumption, but for convenience, that's a reasonable starting point. And if we do that, we actually can figure out everything we need to know about the value of this portfolio. For example, the likelihood that both of these bonds will pay off is 81%, right? 0.9 times 0.9 is 0.81. And then the portfolio is worth 2,000. The likelihood that both of them will default is 0.1 times 0.1, which is 0.01, only a 1% chance that they'll both default, in which case this portfolio is worthless. And then the probability of only one of the two paying off, the other one defaulting, is the remainder, 18%, in which case the special purpose vehicle is worth 1,000. So we now know everything there is to know about the value of the portfolio, and we can now figure out what the value of those blue and orange pieces of paper are. So there's the table of 3 possible outcomes, and there are the probabilities. And it turns out that as long as one of the two bonds pays off, or they both pay off, the blue bondholder will get paid $1,000. The only time that the blue bond defaults is when both of the green bonds in the special purpose vehicle go under. And we know that that's only a 1% likelihood of the blue bond defaulting. On the other hand, the orange bond will only pay off if both of the green bonds pay off. So in these two different states of the world, when one of the two defaults or they both default, unfortunately, the orange bond is out of luck. So now, what would you pay for these two pieces of paper? Using the same kind of expected value calculation, it's not that hard to figure out. The bad state for the senior tranche is 1%. So 1% multiplied by 0, and then multiply 1,000 by 99. Similarly, for the bad state for the junior tranche, that's 19%. 19% times 0, 81% times 1,000. And you're going to get a price of $990 for the blue bond and $810 for the orange bond. Well, what have we done? Once again, we've not created or destroyed value, right? The numbers still add up to a total of 1,800, which is the expected value of the portfolio. It's the expected value of the two green bonds. But we've actually done something quite remarkable. And I first understood how remarkable it was when somebody explained to me by way of an analogy as to how remarkable it is. And the analogy is this. I was told that the children of two ugly parents are rarely attractive. That doesn't apply to anybody here, of course. But what we've just done is something remarkable. We've got two ugly parents, these green bonds, and out of these two ugly parents, we've produced one beautiful-looking supermodel and one deformed, ugly Quasimodo. Here's the supermodel in the sense that this is a very, very reliable bond. It only defaults 1% of the time. But the orange bond, that seems terrible. It defaults 19% of the time. That's even worse than the original green bonds that you weren't all that interested in, right? Well, let's ask the question, how good or bad are these? How would you rate them if you were, say, a rating agency? And so let's take a look. Let's take a look at rating agencies and see what they do. So here's data from Moody's. Moody's is one of the big 3 rating agency companies. This is data on the actual realized default rates of bonds that were rated according to the various different categories that Moody's does from 1920 to 2008. So they took all the bonds that they've ever given a rating to over that period of time. It's a long history, right? And they looked at these different categories. AAA is the very best, right? And then there's AA, single A, BAA, and so on. And what's plotted in this graph is the actual default rates of bonds that first came out with the particular ratings listed over a period of 1 year, which is the blue bars, 5 years, which is the red bars, 10 years, which is the green bars, and 20 years, which is the purple bars. So let's just take a look at the AAA category. It turns out that you can only see 2 bars here because the first 2 bars, the 1 year and 5 year default rates, are so low they don't actually show up. In particular, what this says is that once a bond is rated AAA, the likelihood 1 year out that that bond actually defaults is less than 2/100ths of 1%. On the other hand, if you take that AAA bond and you wait 10 years, even a AAA bond that's rated initially 10 years, even some of those will go under. And in fact, we see that the probability 10 years later, after you issue a AAA bond, the default rate is 0.9%, 0.9%, right? Less than 1%. On the other hand, if you wait long enough, you wait 20 years, the default rate for AAA bonds is about 2%. So just looking at this chart, how would you rate our blue bond? What would you rate it? Yeah, AAA, of course. Because 1% default rate is pretty much a senior tranche that's right in that AAA category. What about the orange bond? Well, the orange bond had a 19% default rate, right? And so you look down here, and what I've written in numbers is the 10-year default rate, the actual historical default rate. So you go down here and you look, BA is 18.4%. So our orange bonds look like, if you were going to rate them, you would rate them BA. And that would be about right. But of course, that's actually important because BA is said to be below investment grade. And the term investment grade has actual legal and investment ramifications because certain kinds of investors are not allowed to invest in non-investment grade debt. I'll come back to that in a minute. Let's keep talking about the senior tranche. The senior tranche is a beautiful thing. We've now taken these 2 green bonds that are not particularly interesting, and we've created a AAA security so that investors, many of them who can only invest in high-quality instruments like money market funds, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, they don't really want to get into the high-yield category. They want to focus on the safer stuff. They can now invest in these green bonds indirectly through these special purpose vehicles. But for certain kinds of companies like money market funds, actually even AAA is not safe enough. Even a 1% default rate is too high. So these financial engineering geniuses, they realized this. And they came up with an interesting innovation. They said, why don't we do this? Why don't we, the issuer, go out and purchase insurance on the AAA bonds for you, the buyer? We will insure these bonds so that in the very unlikely 1% chance that they default, you will get your principal back from the insurance company. And we'll make sure that this is a very, very reliable insurance company. Like, I don't know, how about AIG? So they did. And so they created what were called super senior tranches. These are AAA securities that have insurance on top of that, so they're even better than AAA. And now, all of a sudden, everybody is interested in buying these securities. Money market funds, pension funds, municipalities, sovereign wealth funds, all sorts of buyers that in the past would have nothing to do with these green pieces of paper. They now are very interested in these securities because these are safe, they've got insurance, and there's a lot of these out there in the marketplace. They're liquid. It's a wonderful thing. What about the orange bonds, the bonds that are below investment grade? Who would want them? Who would buy them? Somebody's got to buy them, right? Otherwise, this is not going to work. You got to get rid of them as well. How do you do that?
Secondary market hedge funds?
Hedge funds, exactly. Because hedge funds are in the business of taking risk. They don't mind defaults as long as when they do get paid, they get paid a lot. And how much do they get paid? Well, we'll see in a minute what the pricing is. But before we do that, let me show you how well this worked. Let's take a look at the numbers of how much securitization did to the mortgage market. This is data from the industry where we have mortgage-related debt issuance year by year from 1996 to 2010. In 1996, the United States issued about $480 billion of mortgage-related debt. So this includes mortgages as well as all the CDOs and CDO squareds that were based on these mortgages. $480 billion in 1996. 7 years later, in 2003, that number turns to over $3 trillion. $3 trillion in 1 year. In 1 year, we issued $3 trillion of mortgage-related debt. Shortly thereafter, Paul Krugman, the New York Times columnist and Nobel Prize-winning economist, was asked to summarize in one sentence or less the entire US economy. And he did. He said, it's very simple. We sell each other homes using money borrowed from the Chinese. That's it. And he wasn't far wrong. That's a tremendous number. And it was because we created tremendous demand for these securities through the magic of securitization and financial innovation. What could possibly go wrong with this picture? Well, let me tell you what went wrong. This is a quote from a risk manager at a major investment bank. And The Economist magazine published this in a very unusual format. They published it anonymously, which they almost never do. But for obvious reasons, this individual didn't want to be named. But let me describe to you what he wrote here and how it all came down. In May 2005, we held AAA tranches, expecting them to rise in value, and sold non-investment grade tranches, expecting them to go down. From a risk management point of view, this was perfect. Have a long position in the low risk asset and a short one in the higher risk one. But the reverse happened of what we had expected. AAA tranches went down in price, and non-investment grade tranches went up, resulting in losses as we marked the positions to market. This was entirely counterintuitive. Explanations of why this had happened were confusing and focused on complicated cross-correlations between tranches. In essence, it turned out that there had been a short squeeze in non-investment grade tranches, driving the prices up and a general selling of all more senior structured tranches, even the very best AAA ones. Now, if you didn't understand that, you shouldn't feel bad, because apparently he didn't either. But it was his job to. Now, let me show you in the space of 3 more minutes on this topic exactly what happened. And after that, everybody, all of you will understand what happened. First of all, let's go back to the pricing of this. All right? Remember that the pricing of the senior tranche was $990, and the pricing of the junior tranche was $810. Now, think about that. As a hedge fund, if you bought this security for $810 and it pays off, it pays $1,000, you've made a very, very nice return. It's risky, but when it does pay off, you've made a great return, right? And vice versa, if you bought it for $990 and it went under, that's a real problem for you. Now, let's take a look at one thing here. We assumed at the very start that these 2 green bonds were uncorrelated. What if they became correlated? What if they became very highly correlated? Now, why should correlations among defaults change over time? Well, it's actually pretty easy to see. When you are going in an up market, going up that slope is not all that different from going up a roller coaster, right? Those of you who've ever ridden on roller coasters, some of you who enjoy it, I'm sure that there's an exhilaration. My wife hates roller coasters, so one time my 10-year-old was able to convince her to go on a roller coaster ride with him. She thought it was one of these kiddie roller coasters, and when they left the bay where they got in, all of a sudden they went to this hill and click, 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 click. After a few seconds, she realized that she had made a terrible mistake, because this thing went up and click, click, click. My son was delighted. He was giddy with excitement. As you're going up, click, 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 you realize what's coming. You realize that at some point, you're going down. And I never heard my wife scream so loud when they went down. It was, it actually hurt my ears, and I wasn't even on the roller coaster. When you go down, defaults become very highly correlated. On the way up, a default in Reno, Nevada has nothing to do with a default in Stockton, California. But on the way down, if there's a national decline in home prices, then in fact, by definition, the defaults become highly correlated. So let's go back to this example and ask, what if the defaults of the 2 green pieces of paper were perfectly correlated? In other words, they defaulted and paid off exactly in the same states of the world. Well, if that's the case, then you don't have three outcomes. You only have two. They all both pay off or they both default. And if there are only two possible outcomes, then guess what? These two pieces of paper are actually worth the same. How much are they worth? Well, they're actually worth $900 each. Now, what's the big deal? That's no problem, isn't it? Well, it is a problem because think about it. The AAA folks, they paid $990 for that blue piece of paper. $990. And actually, they probably paid more because there was extra insurance on top of that. So it's super senior. They might have paid $995. And who was it that was buying these blue pieces of paper with extra insurance? These are money market funds like the primary reserve fund. You might have heard of that. These funds are not expecting to lose principal. But when you buy one of these blue pieces of paper and all of a sudden what was uncorrelated becomes perfectly correlated, you've just now lost 10% of your investment. A loss of 10% is disastrous for a money market fund. It's disastrous for a bank. It's disastrous for pension funds. Now, who made out? Well, remember the hedge funds? Those entrepreneurial folks that were paying $810? Their pieces of paper are now worth $900. So value is neither destroyed nor created. It's simply shifted from the banks to the hedge funds. And that's the financial crisis in a nutshell, at least ground zero of the financial crisis. Now, how could this have happened? I mean, this seems so obvious to us now, to all of you, in hindsight. But where were people in 2004, 5, and 6? How come we didn't see this? Well, that's a more complicated issue that I won't have time to talk about today. But let me give you a hint as to how it could have happened. And the way I'm going to do that is by asking who benefited from the housing bubble? Who benefited from that roller coaster ride on the way up? And if you do an honest accounting of who benefited, well, here they are in alphabetical order. These are all of the stakeholders in our economy that benefited. Pretty much everybody benefited from commercial banks, rating agencies, economists, government-sponsored enterprises, homeowners, insurance companies, investment banks, investors, mortgage lenders, politicians, and regulators. Everybody looked good on the way up. Now, I'm not saying that we're all equally to blame, and we have to be careful here because if you say that everybody's to blame, then effectively nobody's to blame. And that's not the message that I'm trying to convey. My point, though, is that to get a housing bubble of the magnitude that we did requires tremendous incentives on everybody's part. Everybody has to participate, which is one of the reasons why, to this day, we still haven't put anybody in jail. There may very well be people that need to be put in jail, but the problem is it's awfully hard to identify a lineup of 100 million people where everybody is a suspect. Someone once said that a rising tide lifts all boats. I think it was Warren Buffett who added that it's only when the tide goes out that you can see who's swimming naked. And apparently a lot of people were swimming naked. So that's one of the reasons why it's going to be difficult to trace back the one or two causes or parties involved. It's a lot of different things. Not to say that we shouldn't go through the exercise, and we are in many cases. But the fact is that this kind of phenomenon is really linked to something about modern society that really didn't exist even a few decades ago. It's that innovation, large-scale innovation of the kind that we're talking about, really requires financial infrastructure. It requires private sector investment, but it also requires all of the trappings of a reasonably well-functioning economy. Things like accounting, legal, and regulatory infrastructure, systemic stability, well-functioning capital markets, a proper design of securities. But most of all, it requires incentives, proper incentives. That's really the purpose of the financial system. It's to provide people with the proper incentives and information to be able to do what they need to do in order for us to continue growing as an economy. Now, psychologists tell us that there are two ways to motivate people: fear and greed. So if I wanted to motivate all of you to leave this room, I could build a fire right up here. You'll see the smoke billowing. And I'm going to guess that most of you will file out pretty quickly through the back exit. But the problem with fear is that it doesn't last long. It's actually impossible to be fearful for any length of time. If you are, you will die. A human cannot stay in a state of fear for days and weeks. Greed, on the other hand, is very sustainable. Fear works faster, but greed lasts longer. And by the way, let me mention that greed and altruism are not always incompatible. They don't have to be incompatible. And from that perspective, we have all of this emphasis lately on sustainability. I think we may have forgotten that actually greed is more sustainable. And so if we could provide the proper incentives to do the right thing, we might be able to do that in a far more time-efficient and effective manner. So let me give you an example of the power of incentives that has nothing to do with finance and has nothing to do with cancer. It has to do with something that happened just about 4 years ago, which is the DARPA Network Challenge. Now, I don't know how many of you have heard of the DARPA Network Challenge, but DARPA, for those of you who don't know, is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. It's part of the Defense Department that supports various kinds of research efforts at universities like MIT. And so in 2009, DARPA was celebrating their 40th anniversary. And so they decided to celebrate with a contest. And the contest was this. DARPA was going to affix 10 large red weather balloons in randomly placed locations throughout the 50 United States. And the first person or team that could identify the exact longitude and latitudes of these 10 weather balloons would receive a prize of $40,000. That was the contest. And so they announced it in advance, and they got people to sign up on their website to participate. And at a certain point in time, they said, go, the balloons are in place, go for it. And the teams went after that. So the question is, how long do you think it took the winning team to identify the locations? Now, remember, this is 2009, so it's not that long ago, but even so, over the last 3.5 years, social media has made some tremendous progress. But in 2009, we had the internet, we had Facebook, we had Twitter, we had all of these things. And so you could use all of that to your benefit. And so imagine if I were to tell you right now, go off and do this. I want you to go off right now and look for these 10 weather balloons and get your friends and family and anybody you want to help you, starting right now. How long do you think it would take to get this done? And remember, it's anywhere in the 50 United States. And the United States is pretty big. It's a big place, right? I was in Montana recently, and man, that's a big place. Just, I now understand why they call it the big sky. I mean, there's nothing else. It's like really big. How long do you think it would take? If you asked me, I would have guessed a week, 5 days, 7 days, 10 days, something like that. I mean, people have said, well, you've got email, right? You can email your friends and your friends' friends and so on. I can't even get my brother to respond to my emails in a timely fashion. How are you going to get your friends to stop what they're doing, go out and look for a red weather balloon and tell you where it is? Well, let me tell you, the winning team was from MIT. It was Sandy Pentland and his colleagues at the MIT Media Lab. Yep. And you know how long it took them? It took them 8 hours, 52 minutes, 41 seconds, which is, I was blown away by that. Actually, it was even less. It took them about 2.5 hours. The other 6 hours was to make sure they didn't have any false positives to go through all of the various different emails that they got. 8 hours, 52 minutes, 41 seconds. Now, how? How did they do this? This is incredible. Well, I'll tell you how. They did it through financial engineering. Now, that's not how they would characterize it, but that's how I'm going to characterize it. And let me tell you how they did it, so you'll tell me at the end whether you believe me that it's financial engineering. So first of all, they set up a website, and they announced that they were in the contest and that they were going to do their best to try to use social media to help them. And in particular, what they were going to do is take all of the prize money, if they won, and pay it out, all of it, to the people that would help them. That's good, right? Giving them incentives. But they went further. They said, we're going to do this in a very specific way. We're going to devote $4,000 for every balloon. $4,000 per balloon, 10 balloons, $40,000. It adds up, right? It's credible. And the way we're going to do it is this. If we win, and you helped us by sending us the longitude and latitude of one of these balloons, we will pay you $2,000. So we'll pay you $2,000 if you give us a longitude and latitude. But if you don't give us a longitude and latitude, however, if you email a friend and your friend gives us the longitude and latitude, we'll pay your friend $2,000 and we'll pay you $1,000. If you email a friend who emails a friend who emails us the coordinates, we'll pay that person $2,000. The one in the middle, $1,000, we'll pay you $500. And on and on and on. Everybody gets paid along the way. Everybody benefits. And thanks to the magic of infinite series, it adds up to $4,000. Everybody gets paid along the way. Does that sound familiar to you? Does that sound like the financial crisis where everybody benefited in the system? Everybody gets paid along the way. And by the end of this process, they had about 10,000 people helping them in the space of 8 hours, 52 minutes, and 41 seconds. It's the power of incentives. Now, when I take a look at this graph, I no longer look at it the same way. When I look at that last 10 years, I don't just shake my head and say, how stupid were we buying houses we didn't need, using money we didn't have. I look at that now and I see something else. What I see, and what I'm hoping you will see, is the financial equivalent of E equal MC squared. In other words, there is tremendous power locked up in financial markets, tremendous power, if we only knew how to tap it properly, responsibly, and in a directed fashion. That's the challenge. $3 trillion in 2003. That's how much money we raised. And not just from the US. There are global investors that participated in this housing bubble. Now, what if we could focus this power for good? Not that real estate is evil, but what if we could focus this on social priorities? I'm going to make a rather bold claim today. I'm going to argue that if we can focus the enormous potential of financial markets using financial engineering, then 3 of society's biggest challenges can be solved within the next 2 decades. And those 3 challenges are cancer, the energy crisis, and global warming. We can solve them, not just deal with them, but completely resolve these issues. Now you might ask, how? How are we going to do that? And usually, if I've timed my talk correctly, I'm out of time and I can't tell you. I've got to conclude. But unfortunately, I see that we have an extra half hour here. So, but I'm prepared. I have a response. My first response is, I have no idea. I don't know how. But collectively, I believe that we know how. In fact, I'm thinking that maybe even in this audience, we have enough brain power to figure out how. But the challenge is to figure out how to tap into the collective wisdom of the crowd. And so let me show you a conjecture about how we might go about doing this with cancer. I'm going to ask you to put on your investment hats and see whether you'll be willing to invest your money in a cancer drug development project. Now, cancer is a very serious matter. We know from the American Cancer Society that the probability of somebody living in the United States getting cancer is 1 out of 3 if you're male, 1 out of 2 if you're, 1 out of 3 if you're female, 1 out of 2 if you're male. So cancer really affects everybody. In fact, let me just take a quick poll. How many people in this audience have either dealt directly with cancer or have dealt indirectly with somebody, one of their loved ones that have had cancer? Okay, you see what I mean? So let me ask you whether you'd be willing to invest in a cancer drug development program. And here's what a typical drug development program looks like. I'm going to be very crude. This is a back-of-the-envelope calculation. So those of you who are in the industry, you feel free to raise objections. But I'm trying to be relatively simplistic about this in order to get the idea across. Suppose that a cancer drug takes about $200 million in out-of-pocket costs to develop, from preclinical all the way to new drug application after you get approval from the FDA. $200 million, and it takes 10 years. Now, that $200 million might seem like a low number to those of you who are in the industry, but this is just the cost of taking one chemical compound through the entire process. What it doesn't include is the multiple trials that you might require in order to actually get a successful drug. And so the probability of success of that $200 million shot is going to be 5% in oncology. So the investment is $200 million today. It'll take 10 years before you see any money out of this thing, and there's a 5% success rate. How many people would be willing to invest in this? Okay, do you see why money's leaving the space? In fact, I'm going to ask you a much tougher question, which is not, are you willing to invest your money, but are you willing to invest your parents' money or your children's money in this? And that puts an even higher standard on this. The answer is no, this is way too risky. Now, usually when I teach MBA students, so usually when I give this example, I'll get 1 or 2 students that say, well, I don't know, it depends. What's my rate of return? And I will say, thank you. You know, that's exactly the right question to ask. Nobody even asked that question here, because it doesn't matter if there's a 95% failure rate. But let me tell you what your success looks like in the 5% case where you are able to find a successful drug. So the typical cancer drug earns about $2 billion a year in earnings. And by the time you get the drug approved, which is after 10 years, you'll have a 10-year patent life left. So you'll get $2 billion a year from years 11 through 20. And at a cost of capital of about 10%, that means that the NPV is $12.3 billion in year 10. So $200 million in year 0 versus $12.3 billion in year 10 if you're successful. Of course, that's only 5% of the time. 95% of the time, you get nothing. So let me figure out what the compound rate of return is for you. This particular project will give you a 51% compound rate of return over those first 10 years with 5% probability, and will give you nothing, minus 100%, with 95% probability. For those of you who've taken my investments class, let me show you what the mean and expected return and standard deviation is. So this is an investment that's got a 12% expected return and a 423.5% standard deviation. Now, how many of you would like to invest in this now that you know the numbers? Yeah, nobody. This is not an attractive investment. This is like one of those green bonds, but worse. So what if we, instead of investing in one of them, what if I asked you to invest in 150 of them? Well, you might say, well, why on earth would I want to do that? That's like those 2 old ladies now in the Catskills. Well, it turns out that there is something really magical about finance, which is that when you have a large number of projects that are not perfectly correlated, you actually reduce the risk. And with more shots on goal, that's a term that I only heard recently. I'm not a hockey fan, but you know, now, of course, with the Bruins, everybody's a hockey fan in Boston. With more shots on goal, you have more chances for success. With 150 shots on goal, your portfolio looks very different. How different? Well, first of all, before we do that, we have to talk about the fact that at $200 million a pop, 150 of these shots on goal will require $30 billion. So we do need $30 billion, right? As an economist, I can easily say this. Let's assume we have $30 billion. And we'll deal with that later. I'll deal with that later. Suppose we had $30 billion. Well, if we did, this is what your investment would look like. And now let me also assume that these shots on goal are all statistically independent. I'm going to come back to the assumption of independence a little later on, because obviously we now know that that's a very critical assumption for pricing these securities. If we've got 150 IID, independently and identically distributed shots on goal, guess what? The expected rate of return is still the same, 12%, but now the standard deviation, instead of being 423.5%, it's now 35% standard deviation. Expected rate of return of 12%, standard deviation of 35%. Now, how many people would be willing to invest their parents' or their children's 401k in this? A few more hands. Well, wait, it gets better. All right, it gets better. Can we really raise $30 billion? Well, here's the interesting thing. If I've got 150 shots on goal, each with a 5% success rate, and they're all uncorrelated, do you know what the probability that I'll have at least 2 successes is? I suspect some of you can actually figure it out in your head, given that this is MIT alums here. But the way you figure it out is using a binomial distribution, right? what's the probability of at least 2 successes out of 150 trials with a 5% success rate? It turns out the answer, for those of you who can't do it in your head, is 99.59% probability of at least 2 successes. Think about what that means. That means that with 99.59% probability, I've got a net present value in year 10 of 2 times $12.3 billion. I've got a $25 billion company in year 10 if I can take 150 of these IID projects and put them into a package. And with $24.5 billion of NPV, I can actually issue bonds, long-term bonds, like, I don't know, 10-year bonds, 20-year bonds, which as of February of this year, the 20-year AA average yield was 3.97%. At that yield, this gives me $6.7 billion of cash today from a $24.5 billion debt issue with a maturity of 10 years. Which means that if I issue $24.5 billion in face value of bonds, then that means that my default rate for that is 1 minus 99.59%. That default rate was right within the single A, double A yield level. I can issue debt. And now, if you allow me to use all of the tricks of the trade, if you allow me to construct a senior tranche, a junior tranche, put credit default swaps on this thing, all of the financial engineering tricks of the trade, I can do even better. I can raise more than half of the money from the debt markets as opposed to going to public equity or private equity. Now, why is that significant? Well, it's because, I'm going to show you in a minute, when we do the simulations, that the rates of return that you're getting out of this, both for the bond part and the equity part, are actually pretty decent. They're not fantastic. They're not the kind of rates of return that venture capitalists have come to know and love. But based upon some simulations that we've done of a cancer megafund, using historical data for cancer compounds and using historical correlation figures, we're actually able to get rates of return on the order of, well, let me first show you the structure. We basically have a project that we take from the beginning to phase 1 to phase 2, and maybe we get it approved for drugs, maybe we don't, but we get a whole bunch of them. The whole bunch of these projects essentially give you a sequence of cash flows. We take that sequence of cash flows, and we now use all of the various financial engineering tools, raise a pile of money, give them their intellectual capital, and then over time pay off the bondholders and the equity holders. So that's the basic process. And in our simulations, we're actually able to show that on the equity front, you're getting equity rates of return about 9% to 11%, depending on whether you're doing early stage or late stage. And in this case, we're using a senior tranche that has a 5% yield and a junior tranche that has an 8% yield. More importantly, we have produced software that allows you to do your own simulations if you don't like our assumptions. And we produce it in both MATLAB and R. You can download it from our website. We put an open source license on it. You can take it, modify it, distribute it, steal it. You know, we're hoping you to rip us off and make this a practical reality. Now, there's a lot of fantasy going on here, a lot of assumptions. But let me give you one final fantasy that's actually not so fantastic, which is the fact that the business model in the biopharma industry is changing pretty dramatically. And it's changing thanks to science getting better and better. One example of that is orphan diseases. Orphan diseases, by definition, are diseases that affect less than 200,000 people. But the vast majority of these diseases that have been called orphan affect patient populations on the order of 10,000 people. It turns out that thanks to the miracle of molecular biology, we're actually able to figure out medicines for each of these individuals, each of these orphan diseases. Not in all cases, certainly, but in a number of them, in some very visible cases. And I'm going to skip the details of this, but I want to point out that even in the case of orphan diseases, using this approach can actually be quite profitable. And you'll have a copy of these slides so you can take a look at what's going on. And if it turns out that we can turn all diseases into orphans, we see some really remarkable things happening. Now, is this realistic? And this is where the numbers become really interesting. First question, is there capacity to raise $30 billion? Well, let me tell you about some numbers that I think you'll find interesting. In 2010, the size of the entire US bond market was, anybody know how big US bond markets were? $35 trillion. $35 trillion. Mutual funds, 12 trillion. Money market funds, $1 trillion. The single Norwegian sovereign wealth fund, 537 billion. CalPERS, 226 billion. And by the way, public pension funds are not looking for double and triple digit rates of return. In 2010, they were looking for 8%. That number's been lowered to 7.5% now. Does anybody know what the entire VC industry was back in 2010? If you took all the VCs in the US, across all the industries, across all the funds, you put them to a pile, that amount of money was $176 billion. There is no way you're going to get $30 billion from venture capitalists. It's too big. It's way too big. So I would argue that having debt markets available to these investments in the same way that mortgages, credit cards, auto loans, movie rights, music royalties have access to the debt markets, if we had drug development programs have access to these debt markets, you'll see some tremendous resources flowing into the system. With some imagination, I think this is achievable. So what kind of imagination? Well, let me give you an example. Let's imagine that we create a $30 billion cure for cancer fund. I know that that's simplistic. Cancer is not one disease. It's more like 200 different diseases. And curing it may be a tall order. But the fact that it's 200 diseases gives us natural diversification. And obviously, there are some cancers that we have been able to cure, like certain kinds of leukemia. Imagine creating an impressive advisory board of the world's experts, both in biomedicine as well as in business. So people on the biomedical side like George Dimitri, Eric Lander, Bob Langer, Mark Levin, Frank McCormick, Phil Sharp, and Harold Varmus. For those of you who are in the biotech and pharma space, you know who these people are. They're the very best in their field. And on the business front, how about people like Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, Jacob Goldfield, Bob Merton, Jim Simons, George Soros, and Bill Sharp? Now, the folks in blue, I don't know them and they don't know me. And so if I call them to participate in this kind of a cancer megafund, I seriously doubt that they would return my phone calls. The folks in green, the business folks, most of them, they do know who I am, which is why if I call them, I know that they won't return my phone calls. But if you raise $30 billion, I guarantee you every one of these folks will return your phone calls. Not because of the money. The folks in blue, they couldn't care less about the money. They're not driven by money. And the folks in green, they have all the money. They'll return your phone calls because with $30 billion, you might just actually succeed. You might actually be able to make a difference. Imagine corporations like pension funds, foundations, endowments, insurance companies investing in a cancer megafund of this type. In fact, there is one kind of an organization who would use this fund as a natural hedge against their business risk. Anybody know who that is? Exactly, insurance companies. Insurance companies have longevity risk, right? They write annuities, and so they're effectively betting that you're going to die sooner rather than later. So they can try to hedge that bet one of two ways. They can either invest in things that kill you, like carcinogens, or they can invest on the other side and basically provide some kind of a counterbalance to their exposures. But what about doing this even on a retail basis? How many of you would be willing to invest as a one-time investment $3,000 of your parents' or your children's college fund, 401k fund, life savings, on a one-time basis, $3,000 investment in a cancer megafund with these folks as the scientific and business advisory board? Raise your hand. Yeah, well, you know, I only needed 8% of you to raise your hand because there are 130 million households in the United States, and if 8% say yes, I've got my $30 billion right there. And finally, imagine the government getting involved. I know it's hard to do that now. Someone told me recently that in the way that pro is the opposite of con, progress is the opposite of. Yeah, so it's kind of hard to imagine the government doing anything, but the government has been effective in certain respects. And by the way, cancer happens to be an equal opportunity killer. Doesn't matter whether or not you're green or red or blue or whatever. Imagine the government providing tax incentives, credit enhancement. Think Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac for cancer. We can do this. Now, there are lots of potential challenges, and this is where the limitations of what my colleagues and I know are very apparent. There are a number of difficulties with this approach: size, centralization, capacity, complexity, excesses, ethics. All of these issues are things that we certainly have no idea about, and we need the help of all the participants in our stakeholder community to address. So we're actually holding a conference in a couple of weeks here at MIT called CancerX. You can take a look at the conference, cancerx.mit.edu, where we're bringing together all of the various different stakeholders: oncologists, scientists, the FDA, investors, rating agencies. We're bringing them together to try to explore these issues and see whether or not this is something that we can actually do. So let me conclude, and I'll be happy to answer some questions. Let me conclude by saying that, we've had a war on cancer since 1971. And I'm not qualified to judge whether or not we're winning or losing the war. A number of people have argued both sides of that controversy. But I will argue that war, I think, is the wrong metaphor, because war is based on fear. And as I mentioned, fear is not sustainable. Greed is. And so instead of putting a war on cancer, what we ought to do is to put a price tag on its head. We ought to motivate people with greed. With sufficient scale, we can actually do well by doing good. And I want to acknowledge that finance doesn't always have to be a zero-sum game if it's used properly. And I have to be sensitive here, because when you talk about cancer, you're talking about people's lives. My mother died of cancer 2 years ago, so I get it. One of our beloved administrators and a longtime friend and colleague of ours, Svetlana Sussman, died of cancer just this morning. And so this is dedicated to her. Some people would say that talking about investments, rates of return in the same breath as losing a loved one is just offensive and obscene. I get it. But the problem is that if we don't do that, if we don't focus on incentives and the proper business structure of these kinds of activities, we actually won't have any chance of dealing with challenges as big as cancer. It is just too big for the foundations and nonprofits and the generosity of people to deal with. Those are all very important aspects of this ecosystem, but we need more. We need the private sector. And this is where all of you can help. MIT has got some amazing alumni connections. We are the smartest people in the world at this university. And I think that the future of our healthcare system, the future of science, the future of business happens to be here at this great institution. And that's why I'm privileged to be a faculty member. Thank you very much for coming, and I appreciate your attention. We have time for a few questions, Paul? Great. Yes, back there. Is there a microphone, or maybe you can just shout and I'll repeat your question if people don't hear.
Thank you very much for your talk. You were introduced as a rock star, and I have all of your records.
Thank you.
You mentioned 3 challenges: cancer, energy, and climate change. And I already buy the argument that you've given here today that financial engineering can cure cancer, because each of those trials has some probability of payoff at the end. How can you apply this to climate change?
Well, I was afraid somebody was going to ask that question, and I haven't timed my talk well enough. We have too much time. Actually, though, I have an answer, not surprisingly. There are a number of technologies that actually we haven't explored with regard to climate change, or rather, I shouldn't say that we haven't explored. There are individuals out there who have ideas that where they don't have enough funding to explore them in greater depth. Here's one example. I believe that climate change is going to be impossible to solve by collaboration and common agreement to cut back on greenhouse gases. I just think it's like telling a teenager, to abstain in order to prevent teenage pregnancy. You can say abstain all you want, but in the end, human nature will do its thing. So why not acknowledge that we're not going to be able to cut back on our greenhouse gas emissions and figure out a way to take greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere? Just last year, there was a report in one of the scientific magazines, I don't know if it was Nature or Science, where they found a bacteria that could be genetically engineered to capture and digest carbon dioxide and methane. And I think methane was the key, because that's the worst kind of greenhouse gas. Well, imagine if we could somehow create a type of bacterium that can be dispersed in the atmosphere to collect and transform methane into, I don't know, water and oxygen. That would be pretty incredible. Well, that's not science fiction. That's actually within science possibility. But maybe it's going to cost, I don't know, $5 billion to look at that. Well, do you think $5 billion is worth it to save the planet? I would argue that that's a pretty good trade-off. But the problem is you've got to get the conduit for the investors to be able to put money into that and then to be able to benefit from that. So right now, everybody's responsible for greenhouse gases, so nobody's responsible. There's no property rights. There's no way that we can provide incentives for people to do the right thing. So people have argued, let's put a carbon tax, and I'm not arguing that's a bad idea. I'm just saying it's unrealistic, because I don't think we're going to get an agreement on that. But eventually, I think that putting some kind of a price on having this wonderful oxygen, in this atmosphere is the way to go. So that's one example of being able to use finance to explore solutions. Another example is geoengineering. I know that this also sounds like science fiction. Sending up lots and lots of little solar shields, 3x3 kind of gossamer type of fabric that can reflect sunlight, but sending out billions of them out into orbit and being able to shield ourselves from the rays of the sun to slow down some of this climate change or global warming. We certainly have the technology to do that. We don't have the expertise to know how to control it and whether it'll work, so maybe that's going to take another $20 or $30 billion to figure that one out. I can't be the only ones coming up with these harebrained ideas. I'm sure that there are engineers out there that are far smarter than me that have been thinking about this, that have tons of ideas. Do they have the resources that they need? Do you think that giving them another $25 or $50 billion might actually make a difference? Well, I would argue that it does. And frankly, I've been emboldened by the financial crisis. We wrote a check to General Motors for $40 billion. We wrote a check to AIG for $120 billion. So I'm happy to talk about $10 and $20 billion increments in order for us to solve some of these biggest challenges. The key is how do we get the right incentives to make that pay off for investors. If you can figure that out, you can actually get the money to these folks. Yes?
I'm in the master's class in '93. I did take your class. I came from LA, and we put up a little brief short Indiegogo campaign with one of the Indiegogo founders for the Sean Collier Farm. That's my one shameless plug. But I did want to ask you about the impact that you've thought of crowdfunding on advancing capital market efficiency and engaging these households to sell these type of bonds directly in securities, especially given the relative failure of banks as financial intermediaries.
So that's a great question, and actually a great thing that you've done for Officer Collier, so thank you for doing that. In terms of crowdfunding, this is exactly what I'm talking about. All of what I've said is about crowdfunding. Not just crowdfunding in terms of getting money, but if you look at the Cancer X conference, that's crowdsourcing in terms of getting the intelligence that we need to figure out whether we can actually do this thing. I don't know anybody, any one person who can give me the answer of how to do this. And I've tried, believe me. I've asked everybody that I know. The fact is that we need the crowd more and more because the challenges to society are bigger and bigger and bigger. This kind of approach is not appropriate for everything. For example, I suspect that with $30 billion, we could cure athlete's foot. But I don't think that athlete's foot is a big enough challenge that investors are going to be able to get a decent rate of return. And so crowdfunding is absolutely right. The one caveat that I would put, you had asked about retail investing, and I gave that example. I think that it would be easy to raise money from retail investors. I'm nervous about that. And the reason I'm nervous about that is that I actually am not worried that this technique won't work. My worry is exactly the opposite. I think that this technique will work way too well. What I mean is that I think if we used the retail vehicle to raise money first, we can raise a ton of money very quickly. Just look at the hands that went up. The problem is that if we raise too much money and we don't have the right structure and there's a bad outcome, that could basically kill this approach for the next 20 years. And I don't want to do that. So I would argue against retail participation because all of us, we want to do something. I mean, heck, the reason I'm doing this is because as an economist sitting in the waiting lounge for my mother who's getting treated for cancer, I feel totally helpless and useless. If I could wash the test tubes of Bob Langer and increase the chances of curing cancer, I'd be in his lab every day washing his test tubes. I can't do that. So what do? I do this. And what do we all do? We can write a check. But the problem with that is that it should only be done if you're going to get a decent rate of return on your investment. And if we do that, then we're talking about a sustainable approach to trying to solve this problem. So I would argue, let's not get retail investors involved right now. Let's get the institutional investors who are going to be much more hard-nosed about writing that check. They're going to be looking out for their plan participants, their particular parties. They've got fiduciary responsibility. They're not going to be moved by heartstrings, and we don't want to tug on those heartstrings at this point because I think that would cloud your judgment as to whether or not this is going to be a good investment or a bad investment. Yes, back there.
Thank you very much for the presentation. The one thing you focused on a lot was the therapeutic angle of everything. And I think the biggest thing and incentives that I'm missing in the financial world is to the diagnostic part. So because there's so much biomarkers that you could tie antibodies to, and I can actually tell at an earlier stage when you have cancer, the two things I'm really curious about from a financial standpoint is how do you increase that 5% probability?
Yeah.
And like I think when you said at the beginning, you set the stage that this person had cancer reoccur for the second time, and I use renal cell carcinoma as a big example.
Yeah.
That you only get symptoms when it's the size of a lime.
Right.
And when it's the size of a lime, you have a 4.6 chance for survival.
Yeah.
If I could detect it at the size of a pea, you have a 98% chance for survival.
Yeah.
So I'm really interested in how do you incentivize the diagnostic space to inform and increase that probability for the therapeutic space.
So, that's a great question, and obviously I'm not qualified to answer that, but since I'm a professor, I'll answer it anyway. No, I'll answer it by channeling smarter people than me who I've talked to about the device space. The interesting thing about medical devices is that the risks are lower because you're not talking about putting drugs in people and possibly getting side effects that will kill them. So the risks are lower, and the time to approval is less. So the amount of money that you need in order to make a really big impact in medical devices is smaller. Having said that, though, I think that there's some really interesting opportunities to make breakthroughs that from people that I know who are working in the space, they're on the verge of what they call molecular imaging in ways that can really transform how we diagnose these kind of diseases. Let me add one further comment to it, which is I didn't really get a chance to go into my orphan disease discussion because I know we're running short on time. But if you think about what an orphan disease is, there are some scientists and medical experts out there who think that ultimately the demonstration of what they call precision medicine is to make everything an orphan disease. In other words, to be able to figure out that there are only 5,000 people that have this kind of cancer, 4,000 people that have that kind of cancer, to divide and conquer. And if you can divide and conquer to a narrow enough scale, you've actually increased the number of shots on goal while at the same time reducing your correlations. That might be a recipe for a new business model in the biopharma industry. So I think that your comments are very apropos, and that's one of the reasons why we're having this conference the week after next, is to try to bring all of these experts together so that they can hear the financing approaches that they might not have known about, and the investment bankers in the middle being able to actually put the two together. Last question. Yes?
Actually, a few more words about the capacity, intellectual capacity, laboratory capacity to receive this level of investment.
Sure, I'd be happy to. One of the biggest concerns that I had going into this was that maybe there's money coming out of the space just because there's not enough good people, and money should be coming out of the space. We see that happening a lot, and it makes perfect sense. And since I'm an economist, I believe that markets work and that you shouldn't fiddle with them too much, but that there are situations where we have some kind of breakdown that you can actually do something about. So I did what you would expect me to do. I asked the experts, and it just so happens that here at MIT, we happen to have one or two experts in cancer. More than one or two. We have the Koch Institute, we have the Broad Institute, we have the Whitehead Institute. There's some tremendous resources here. Every one of these individuals that I talked to at MIT, as well as at Dana-Farber, at Beth Israel, at Mass General, at Brigham and Women, all of these oncologists tell me the same thing, which is that they've got 25 ideas, and they've got funding for one of them. And the funding is decreasing. NIH is cutting back on the funding. The private sector, money's leaving the space, so it's harder and harder to start a company. And then I talk to the biotech entrepreneurs who tell me that they've got all sorts of pathways that are yet unexplored, but they've chosen the pathways that they have because they've got financing constraints and milestones that they have to hit in order to be able to make their next payment. Can you imagine a stupider way of conducting a scientific investigation than looking at your accounting statements to figure out whether you can afford to do the next experiment? It just seems so antithetical to what a scientist should be doing. And yet we force that upon them because they don't have enough resources. So from that perspective, it seems like there are way more projects and opportunities than there's money to fund them. And I've read resources that have said that there are 800 cancer compounds that are waiting for testing, and it's a 20-year backlog. Now, what about people? Here, I'm much less sure, and so I've had to rely on published sources. A couple of years ago, there was an article in Nature that said that we are producing way too many PhDs and there are not enough jobs. And the single largest group of PhDs that we are producing that don't have jobs are in the life sciences. So I think that there are people out there that would be delighted to work on cancer. By a show of hands, we saw that virtually everybody is touched by cancer. But the problem is that they can't make a living because there's no money to be had. So there's an open question that I'm hoping that our conference will explore, which is why are there no resources there? Is it really because there shouldn't be any resources there? You know, that's why we don't have $30 billion for Athlete's Foot? Or is there something that we can fix with this financial engineering approach? Is it really the riskiness that we can bring down using debt financing? I don't know the answer to that, but my colleagues and I are trying to figure that out. And with your help and with the help of all of the folks at that Cancer X conference, we're hoping to be able to come to a good conclusion. Well, again, thank you very much for coming here and for spending the weekend with us. We welcome you, and thank you for being very patient. I apologize. I have to leave right away. I can't stick around. I'd love to say hi to former students and parents, but I hope to be able to communicate by all of you through email. Thank you.